The hunting knife felt heavy in Elias's frostburned hand as he stood at the frozen river's edge staring at the timber wolf trapped in the shattered ice 20 feet away. Every trapper in Alaska knew the rule: never interfere with a dying predator. But as those amber eyes locked onto his, Elias didn't see a killer waiting to happen. He saw the same desperate loneliness that had driven him into these woods 3 years ago. In the next 8 minutes, against every survival instinct screaming in his brain, he would make a choice that would either kill him by spring or save him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The crack came first, sharp as a rifle shot echoing across the white expanse of the Tanana Valley. Elias had been checking his trapline when the sound froze him mid-step, his breath forming clouds in the -30 air. He knew that sound. Ice giving way under weight it was never meant to hold. He approached the riverbank slowly, his snowshoes crunching through the crusted surface, and that's when he saw it. A massive gray wolf, easily 120 pounds, thrashing in a slush-filled gap where the ice had collapsed and reformed around its body like a frozen vice. The animal's rear leg was bent at an impossible angle, shattered by the shifting plates of ice that had caught it like a steel trap. The wolf's eyes found him immediately, wild, golden, burning with a mixture of fury and something that looked disturbingly like recognition. Its lips pulled back to reveal fangs designed to crush caribou bone, and a low growl rumbled from deep in its chest even as hypothermia visibly claimed its strength with each passing second. Elias knew he should walk away. The village elders at the trading post had told him the stories. A wolf brought into human shelter was a curse, an invitation for the wild to turn against you. His own SAR training had drilled it into him. Never compromise your safety for an animal that would kill you without hesitation. But standing there on that riverbank, watching the wolf's struggles grow weaker, Elias felt something crack inside him that had nothing to do with ice. For 3 years he'd been running from the guilt of that failed rescue mission, hiding in this wilderness, convinced he was too broken to save anyone or anything ever again. The wolf's breathing had become shallow, labored. Maybe 5 minutes left. Elias dropped his pack and began unwinding the coil of rope at his belt, his decision made before his conscious mind could stop him. He was wading into the waist-deep slush before he could think about the insanity of what he was doing. The freezing water shocking the air from his lungs, his body screaming at him to retreat, to survive, to choose himself over this predator that owed him nothing. He reached the wolf and threw the rope around its massive chest, expecting at any moment to feel those jaws close around his throat. Instead, the animal went still, its amber eyes locked on his with an intensity that made Elias's hands shake as he tied the knot. "I save you," he whispered through chattering teeth, beginning the brutal work of hauling 120 pounds of dying wolf through ice and slush toward his sled. And maybe I save myself too. Neither of them knew that this moment, this desperate bargain between a broken man and a broken predator, would be the only thing standing between Elias and death when the blizzard came 6 months later. The wolf's eyes never left him as Elias worked by lantern light, the cabin's single room thick with the smell of wet fur and blood. He'd managed to drag the animal inside on the sled, leaving a trail of ice melt across the floorboards, and now the real gamble began. The leg was worse than he'd thought. The fracture ran through the femur, bone fragments visible through torn muscle. Elias's hands moved with the mechanical precision of his old SAR training, cleaning, setting, splinting, but his mind kept circling back to the same thought. This animal could kill him before he finished the next suture. "Easy," he murmured, more for himself than the wolf. "Easy." The wolf's growl was a continuous rumble, a warning that never quite escalated into attack. Elias had seen that look before in trauma victims, the body shutting down from shock and pain, buying him just enough time to work. He wrapped the splint tight, secured it with strips torn from an old flannel shirt, and sat back against the far wall, his own hands trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. The wolf, Akela, he'd started calling it in his head, remembering some half-forgotten story from childhood, lay on a nest of blankets near the wood stove. Its breathing was labored but steady. Alive. For now. That first night, Elias didn't sleep. He sat in the corner with his rifle across his lap, watching those amber eyes watch him back. Every shift of the wolf's body made his finger twitch toward the trigger. Every time the animal's lips pulled back to reveal those killing teeth, Elias wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. By the third day, the pattern had established itself. Elias would approach with food, raw venison from his stores, and set it just within reach. The wolf would eat, never taking its eyes off him, never letting its guard down. Then Elias would change the bandages, checking for infection, his movements slow and deliberate while the animal watched with an intelligence that unnerved him. "You hate this," Elias said on the 5th night, speaking aloud for the first time in months. "Being trapped in here with me. I get it. I hate it too sometimes. Being trapped with myself." The wolf's ear flicked forward, just slightly. "I couldn't save them," Elias continued, the words coming easier now in the lantern-dim quiet. "The hikers. The avalanche came too fast, and I froze. Just froze. They said it wasn't my fault, but—" His voice cracked. "I was supposed to be the one who saved people." Akella's head lowered onto its paws, still watching, still waiting. On the 7th night, Elias finally slept. He woke at dawn to find the wolf's eyes closed, its breathing deep and even, the tension finally gone from its massive frame. And for the first time in 3 years, Elias felt something besides guilt stirring in his chest. It felt almost like hope. The silent pact. The shift came on a morning when fresh snow had buried the world outside in silence so complete Elias could hear his own heartbeat. He was frying venison on the cast-iron stove when he realized Akella was watching him differently. Not with the coiled tension of a predator calculating distance and vulnerability, but with something closer to curiosity. "Hungry?" Elias asked, surprised by how natural his voice sounded after years of disuse. He set a plate of meat on the floor, but this time he didn't retreat to the far wall. He sat down at his small table with his own breakfast, just 10 feet away, and began to eat. The wolf rose slowly, favoring the splinted leg, and limped to the food. They ate together in silence, the only sound the crackle of the wood stove and the scrape of the wolf's teeth on tin. It became their ritual. Breakfast at dawn, dinner at dusk, Elias cooking for 2 like some bachelor gone mad in the wilderness. Which, he supposed, wasn't far from the truth. "Her name was Sarah," he said one evening, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "The hiker who didn't make it. 23 years old, teaching credential, whole life ahead of her." He stared into his coffee mug. "She called for help for 40 minutes while I stood there trying to figure out the safest approach. By the time I reached her, the cold had already won." Akella's ears pricked forward, tracking the pain in his voice. The wolf's leg was healing faster than Elias had dared hope. By the 3rd week, Akella was putting weight on it, moving around the cabin with increasing confidence. Elias found himself talking more, filling the silence with confessions he'd never shared with the grief counselors or his former teammates. "They said I followed protocol, that I made the right call waiting for backup." He laughed bitterly. "But protocol doesn't warm you up at night when you're remembering the sound of someone dying while you do nothing." One night, during a particularly brutal storm that rattled the cabin walls, Elias woke to find Akella had moved closer. Not threatening, just present. The wolf lay near the foot of his bed, a massive gray shadow in the darkness, and for the first time in 3 years, Elias didn't feel completely alone. "You get it, don't you?" he whispered. "What it's like to be broken. To not know if you can ever be whole again." The wolf's tail moved, just once, almost like an answer. They fell into an odd kind of partnership. Elias would read aloud from his worn paperbacks, his voice filling the cabin with stories while Akella listened from its place by the fire. Sometimes the wolf would rest its massive head on its paws and watch him with those ancient amber eyes, and Elias could almost believe he was understood. "Thank you," he said one morning, the words surprising him. "For letting me save you. For letting me try." Spring came late to the valley, but when it arrived, it brought the smell of thawing earth and running water. Elias stood at the window watching the snow melt in rivulets down the hillside, and knew without checking that Akella's leg had healed. The wolf moved without hesitation now, its gait strong and sure, pacing the cabin's perimeter with increasing restlessness. "I know," Elias said quietly. "I know you need to go." For 3 days he delayed the inevitable, inventing reasons to keep the door closed. He told himself it was about ensuring the leg could handle the terrain, about making sure Akella was truly ready. But late at night, lying in his bed with the wolves breathing a steady rhythm across the room, Elias admitted the truth. He wasn't ready. He'd gotten used to the company, to the sound of another living thing sharing his exile. On the fourth morning, he opened the door. The cool air rushed in, carrying scents of pine and distant caribou, of a world vast and wild beyond the cabin's walls. Akela's head snapped toward the opening, nostrils flaring, every muscle in its body suddenly alert. The wolf moved to the threshold and stopped, one paw on the weathered boards, one paw on the muddy earth beyond. Elias crouched down, keeping his distance but needing to say something, anything to mark this moment. "You don't owe me anything. You know that, right? The wild doesn't work that way." His voice caught. "But these weeks, they mattered to me. You mattered." The wolf turned its head, those amber eyes finding his one last time. In that gaze Elias saw intelligence, recognition, something that looked almost like gratitude. Or maybe he was just a lonely man projecting human emotions onto a predator who'd simply tolerated captivity until freedom returned. Then Akela moved. 3 powerful strides carried the wolf off the porch and into the clearing. It paused at the tree line, a gray ghost against the dark pines, and looked back. Just once. A moment suspended in morning light. Man and wolf, savior and saved, each changed by the other in ways neither could articulate. The wolf vanished into the shadows. Elias stood in the doorway long after the trees had swallowed all trace of Akela's passing. The cabin felt enormous suddenly, the silence no longer comfortable but oppressive. He noticed things he'd stopped seeing during the wolf's residency: the worn spots on the floor where Akela had slept, the scratches on the doorframe, the second plate still sitting by the stove. He picked up the plate and washed it slowly, carefully, then put it away in the cupboard. Back to one. Back to how things were supposed to be. That night, Elias lay awake listening to the wind move through the pines, searching for sounds that didn't come. No breathing but his own. No amber eyes watching from the darkness. Just silence, and the crushing weight of solitude he'd somehow forgotten how to bear. The ghost of the woods. The loneliness hit differently this time. Before Akela, the silence had been a choice, a punishment Elias had willingly inflicted on himself. Now it felt like amputation, a phantom limb aching where companionship had briefly existed. He threw himself into work with manic intensity, chopping wood until his shoulders screamed, repairing the cabin roof, hiking his traplines twice daily when once would suffice. Anything to exhaust himself into dreamless sleep, to avoid the evening hours when he'd grown accustomed to talking, to being heard. But the woods had changed. Or maybe he had. The first time he saw the tracks, 3 weeks after Akela's departure, his heart lurched. Massive paw prints in the mud near his porch, fresh from the night before. He followed them to the tree line where they disappeared into the underbrush, and stood there like a fool calling a name into the forest. "Akela. That you?" Only silence answered. The tracks appeared sporadically after that, sometimes circling the cabin at a distance, sometimes approaching within feet of his door. Once, he found them pressed into the snow beside his woodpile, as if something had stood there watching him work. But he never saw the wolf, never caught more than a whisper of movement in his peripheral vision, a gray shadow that vanished when he turned to look. "I know you're out there," he said one evening, standing on his porch in the fading light. "I don't know if you're checking on me or just passing through, but—" He swallowed hard. "I miss you." Is that stupid? Missing a wolf. The forest offered no judgment, no answers. His supplies were running low. He'd need to make the trek to the trading post soon, face the handful of people who lived scattered through these mountains. The thought filled him with dread. He'd spent so long avoiding human contact, and now the only company he craved was the one creature who'd chosen to leave. At night, he caught himself setting out 2 plates before remembering. Caught himself starting conversations with empty air before the absurdity of it struck him. The cabin felt haunted, but not by ghosts of the dead. By the ghost of connection, of purpose, of feeling like something other than a broken machine going through motions. He found a tuft of gray fur snagged on a low branch near the trail. He held it in his palm, studied it in the lantern light, then tucked it into his shirt pocket like a talisman. "Come back," he whispered to the darkness beyond his window. Or don't. I don't know which is crueler. The tracks continued appearing. Always close. Never close enough. And Elias began to understand that some kinds of loneliness were worse than others. The loneliness of having had something precious and losing it. The loneliness of being remembered but not rejoined. The ghost of the woods kept its distance, and Elias learned to live with haunting. The weather report crackling through his emergency radio called it a historic Arctic system. Elias called it a death sentence as he watched the barometer plummet and the sky turn the color of old bruises. He'd weathered bad storms before, but the meteorologist's voice held an edge of fear that made his gut clench. Winds exceeding 90 miles per hour. Whiteout conditions. If you're in the backcountry, shelter in place and pray your shelter holds. Elias spent the afternoon reinforcing what he could. Extra supports under the roof beams. Windows boarded. Wood stove stocked. He filled every container with water and moved his emergency supplies within arm's reach of his bed. All the preparations felt inadequate against what was coming. The storm hit at dusk like a freight train made of ice and fury. The cabin shuddered under the first assault, wind screaming through gaps he didn't know existed. Snow didn't fall so much as materialize out of the darkness, accumulating with terrifying speed. Within an hour, drifts had buried his windows. Within 2, he couldn't see his hand in front of his face when he looked outside. The roof began groaning around midnight. Elias lay in bed listening to the wood beams protest under accumulating weight, doing the math in his head. 6 inches per hour. Wet, heavy snow. The cabin was built for the region but not for this, not for what the radio had called the storm of the century. He should move away from the center of the room, he thought distantly. Should position himself somewhere safer. He was reaching for his lantern when the world came apart with a sound like God snapping his fingers. The central beam gave first, a crack that he felt in his chest. Then the cascade, secondary supports buckling, roof panels imploding inward, a thunder of splintering wood and crushing snow that seemed to last forever and no time at all. Elias tried to roll, tried to move, but the universe had already made its decision. Something massive, the main beam, he thought, caught him across the shins. The pain was white-hot and immediate, driving the air from his lungs in a scream that the storm swallowed instantly. Then came the weight. Hundreds of pounds of snow and debris burying him, pinning his legs, pressing down on his chest until each breath became a battle. The lantern had survived somehow, lying on its side 3 feet away, casting crazy shadows across the wreckage. Elias could see his legs disappearing under a mountain of snow and broken timber. Couldn't feel them anymore. Couldn't feel much of anything except the cold seeping through his clothes, through his skin, settling into his bones with predatory patience. He tried to move the beam. His hands found purchase, but his arms had no strength against that weight. Each attempt left him gasping. Each gasp brought less air. The storm howled outside like laughter. Elias stopped struggling and stared at the ruined ceiling, at the snow still falling through the gaps, and understood with perfect clarity that he was going to die here. Time became fluid in the cold. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, each time surfacing to find the world a little dimmer, his body a little number. The pain in his legs had faded to a distant throb, which he knew was a bad sign. The shivering had stopped too. Also bad. His mind catalogued these symptoms with clinical detachment, the last remnants of his SAR training observing his own death with professional interest. He thought about Sarah, about the sound of her voice calling for help while he'd waited for backup that came too late. At least she'd had someone listening. At least she hadn't died alone in the silent dark. The scratching started so softly he thought he'd imagined it. A rhythmic sound, claws on wood, coming from somewhere beyond the wreckage. Elias's eyes struggled to focus on the overturned lantern, its dying light barely reaching the collapsed doorway. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, joined by a low whuffing sound that bypassed his rational mind and spoke directly to his hindbrain. Predators. Of course. He'd saved a wolf and now the pack had come to collect. There was a bitter poetry to it, the wild taking back what it was owed. He'd interfered with nature's order, and nature was notoriously efficient at balancing accounts. They'd smell the blood, the helplessness. Easy meat trapped and waiting. Go ahead, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. Fair's fair. The scratching intensified. Snow began moving near what used to be the door, debris shifting as something powerful worked from the outside. Elias waited for the first set of teeth, for the tearing pain that would at least be warmer than this creeping cold. Instead, he saw eyes. Dozens of them, glowing amber in the lantern light, appearing one by one through the gaps in the wreckage. But they weren't advancing. They were digging. Powerful bodies throwing snow and broken timber aside with purposeful intensity. And at the center, leading them, was a massive gray wolf with a slight hitch in its gait. Akela. The name came out as a sob. The wolf's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, and the digging became frantic. 5 wolves, 6, 7. Elias lost count as they swarmed the wreckage, working in coordinated chaos to clear the debris. Snow flew in great arcs. Timber was gripped in powerful jaws and dragged aside. They moved with the focused efficiency of a rescue team, and the absurdity of it, wolves conducting a rescue operation, made Elias wonder if hypothermia had finally claimed his mind. But the cold air hitting his face felt real. The weight on his chest lessening felt real. And when Akela's massive head appeared directly above him, those amber eyes meeting his with unmistakable recognition, that felt more real than anything Elias had experienced in 3 years. "You came back," he breathed. The wolf's answering howl split the night, and the pack redoubled their efforts. The pack worked with impossible coordination, clearing enough debris that Elias could finally draw a full breath. But when they tried to shift the beam pinning his legs, even their combined strength wasn't enough. The timber had settled at an angle that made it immovable without equipment, leverage, time. All things Elias didn't have. Akela studied the situation with unnerving intelligence, then made a decision that defied everything Elias knew about wild animals. The wolf lowered itself carefully onto Elias's chest, a controlled descent that avoided his injuries, and settled its full weight across him. Body heat radiated through Elias's soaked clothes like salvation. Then the others came. One by one, the pack arranged themselves around him, along his sides, against his shoulders, even 2 smaller wolves curling near his head. They formed a living blanket, a collective furnace of fur and breath and beating hearts. The contrast was so stark it hurt, from dying alone to being buried in warmth, from abandoned to claimed. "I don't understand," Elias whispered, his hand finding its way to Akela's thick fur. "Why?" The wolf's only answer was to shift closer, sharing heat that Elias's body desperately pulled inward. Around them, the storm continued its assault, but inside this cocoon of wolves, Elias felt his core temperature stabilize, felt sensation begin trickling back into his extremities with pins and needles agony, felt impossibly like he might survive. The pack stayed through the night, through the worst of the blizzard's fury. They took turns shifting positions, maintaining constant contact, their body heat and breath creating a microclimate that kept hypothermia at bay. When Elias drifted toward sleep, Akela would nuzzle his face, keeping him conscious. When he tried to speak, to thank them, the wolves would press closer, as if to say words weren't necessary. Dawn came slowly, the storm finally exhausting itself into eerie stillness. Through the destroyed roof, Elias could see patches of impossible blue sky. And in that morning light, he heard something that made his heart leap, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. The emergency beacon. He'd activated it before the collapse, a last desperate act he'd forgotten in the chaos. The pack heard it too. As one, they rose, shaking snow from their fur. Akela lingered longest, amber eyes holding Elias's gaze with an intensity that felt like communication, like understanding, like goodbye. "Thank you," Elias managed. "For everything. For saving me twice." The wolf's tail moved once. Then Akela led the pack through the wreckage and into the tree line. They vanished like smoke, leaving only tracks in the fresh snow as evidence they'd existed at all. The rescue team found him 20 minutes later. 3 rangers on snowmobiles, their faces shocked at finding him alive under the ruins. As they worked to free his legs, as they radioed for medical evacuation, Elias looked toward the forest where wolf tracks led into shadow. He'd come to the wilderness to hide from humanity. But the wild had taught him something the grief counselors never could, that saving and being saved were 2 sides of the same coin. That connection wasn't weakness but survival. That maybe, just maybe, he was ready to try again. to live among people, to risk caring, to be whole.